Well, good morning again, and let me be another person to welcome you to the journey. If I have not met you, my name is Tim. I'm the lead pastor here at Tower Grove. And if you're new with us for the first time, we have been in a sermon series, as you see on the screen behind me, called Facing God. And what we've been doing in the sermon series is we've been looking at different attributes of who God is, but beyond that, we've been looking at how God enters into our story, and how when God enters into our story, he gives us permission to both be in relationship with him where we're able to experience his beauty, but at the same time, we're able to wrestle with our lives and our circumstances. It is being able to bring both of those together and seeing how God meets us in it. And today, as you just heard in this text, as you just saw in this video, we're going to be talking about this theme of power. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about how God's power really is an indication of his love and his faithfulness to us. That's what Psalm 114 is all about. How God is faithful to his people, how he demonstrates his love through his power. But beyond that, what you're going to see in this text, and the reason why this text is going to be significant to us, is how God's power enters into our pain and our brokenness and our suffering. And this is a relevant topic to us because it doesn't take long to look around at our world and see that there is much pain and brokenness and suffering. As I was preparing this week, I was thinking about almost every single week that we've gathered for the last month and a half. We've come together as a church and we've gathered to pray for something difficult in our world. If you go all the way back to 5 or 6 weeks ago, we were praying together for Charlottesville. We've been praying for the number of hurricanes that have been taking place. We've been praying for division in our city, and then on Monday we wake up and we see another tragedy that happens in Las Vegas, and we are called to pray again. And it's easy when every single week you gather together and pray, and every single week you turn on the news or you get on Twitter to begin to look out and say, God, if you are so powerful, then why don't you intervene? God, if you are who you say that you are, then why are we still dealing with the suffering and the pain of this world? And for some of us, we don't have to look out into our world because that's how we walk in today in our own lives. Like for some of us, we walk in here today and we are crawling, or we are limping, or we are struggling because we look at our lives and we look at the things that we've experienced, we look at the hardships and the burdens and the pain, and it feels like it's too much. And so there's many of us gathered here today saying, God, I know who you say you are. God, I know what you promised to me, but it sure doesn't feel like it right now. God, where are you? God, what are you doing? God, do you hear my prayer? And the reason why that's important is because the same questions that we asked today in 2017 in this moment are the same questions that are being asked in Psalm 114. It's the same questions that people were looking at to God, crying out in their pain and suffering, saying, God, are you who you really say that you are? So as we looked at this text and as we just read this text, I don't know if you felt like you were reading it saying, I have absolutely no idea what's going on right now. This is an incredibly difficult text, and one of the things that makes it tough is it's a lot of imagery and what is happening in that imagery and what am I supposed to be understanding about God and his power. Let me just break this down for you very simply. This text is a story. And within this text, there's actually going to be 4 stories. And these are 4 stories of God's power being demonstrated to the people of Israel. It's a story of God's faithfulness and power and miracle after miracle being performed as the people of Israel are going to experience barriers and suffering in their life. And so I feel like it's important today, before I even talk about God's power and what it means for us, that I just kind of give us a summary of what's happening in Psalm 114, so at least we have a context, at least we have a foundation of what's happening. And really, to understand Psalm 114, you got to go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible. You got to go all the way back to Genesis 17 to understand the history of Israel and God's promise that he made to them. And if you go back to Genesis 17, you are introduced to a guy named Abraham. And Abraham was considered to be the father of Israel. And God one day in Genesis 17 is going to come to Abraham and he's going to make a promise with him. He's going to make a covenant. And this is what God says to Abraham. He says, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. See, what God is going to do in Genesis 17, he's going to come to Abraham and he's going to say, here's my promise, both to you, but also to future generations that we will eventually know as the Israelites. My promise is this: I will be your God and you will be my people. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Now, if God makes that promise with you, that should be a promise of hope. That should be a promise of joy. That should be a promise that gives you security and assurance, right? That's a good promise. I'm your God. I'm with you. You're my people. I am not going to abandon you. But if you know the story of Israel, they have many reasons to question whether or not God is actually going to fulfill that promise. Because the story of Israel is over and over again, they are going to experience hardship and setback and suffering. And as that happens, it's going to cause them to question the promise of God, but it's also going to allow God to reign loud and large over them to actually fulfill his promise. And that's what's happening in Psalm 114. So what are the stories that God is doing in Psalm 114? Well, there's 4. Here's the 4 stories. If you look at verse 1 and verse 3 in this text, this is the story of Israel being under slavery to Egypt. That's what it's talking about in Psalm 114. And if you don't know the story, here's a snapshot of it. For 430 years, the Israelites are going to be enslaved by Egypt. Egypt was the world power during that time. And Pharaoh was the most powerful human ruler during that time. So for 430 years, knowing that God has made this promise, the Israelites are sitting in slavery generation after generation, day after day, saying, okay, God, I know you made this promise, but I do not see the evidence of all. Like, God, hey, when are you going to show up? Hey, God, when are you going to get us out of this? Hey, God, remember what you said to Abraham? We're still waiting. And what God is going to do is God is going to perform a miracle. Actually, he's going to perform a number of miracles. He's going to send 2 men, Moses and Aaron, into Egypt. They're going to confront Pharaoh, and after miracle, eventually Pharaoh is going to be so fed up with what God is doing to him and the Egyptians that he's going to let the Israelites go. And the Israelites are going to flee. So the idea of this is there was a barrier. We don't know how to get out of slavery. God is going to use his power to remove that barrier and to get them out. And then in verse 3, the Israelites are going to get out and they're going to flee. They're going to run away. But the problem is this: Pharaoh has a change of heart. And Pharaoh decides, you know what? I don't really want to let these people get away. I actually need these people for my economy. I need these people to make this place go. So Pharaoh, who, mind you, has the most powerful army in the entire world, is going to go after the Israelites who have no weapons, who have no idea how to fight, who have no idea where they're even going, and he's going to descend upon the Israelites. And the Israelites are going to run and flee, but the problem is this: they are going to get to a barrier, and the barrier is a place called the Red Sea. And they're going to be stuck, and they have no idea where to go, and they have no idea what to do, and God again performs another miracle. He parts the Red Sea, he allows the Israelites to get through, and he destroys the Egyptian army and Pharaoh in the process. Again, there's a barrier, God removes it, God uses his power to provide for his people. Then if you look at verse 4, the story goes on. In verse 4, it tells us the story of Moses meeting God on Mount Sinai. And what God does on Mount Sinai is God calls Moses up the mountain. It says that there's a cloud of smoke. The voice of God is like a thunderous roar. And in that process, God is going to give Moses the 10 Commandments. And God is going to tell Moses, I am the Lord your God who called you out of Egypt, and now this is who I'm calling you to be and how I'm calling you to live. So God is going to guide the Israelite people, and he's going to say, you don't know what to do, I'm going to give you guidance and instruction on how to do it. And so what God is going to do is he's going to call Moses to lead the Israelites to a place called the Promised Land. And he's going to say, I have a land that is going to be a place where you can dwell, and in it I'm going to bless you and your people. And so Moses takes his people, and they start walking. But the problem is they walk for a really, really long time. The Bible tells us that for 40 years they wander in the desert. For 40 years they say, God, why did you bring us out here? Did you just bring us out here to die? And eventually Moses is going to die. And there's going to be another guy named Joshua. And Joshua is going to lead these people, and eventually he's going to bring them into the Promised Land. But that's the third story. If you go to verse 5, what happens in Psalm 114 and verse 5 is that Joshua gets into the Promised Land, but he finds another barrier. And the barrier is this. They hit a place called the Jordan River. And again, God, you've brought us to where we are, but now we have no idea how to get through it. And God uses his power again to part the Jordan River, to allow the Israelites to get through, and to remove a barrier that was in their way. And then the final miracle that we see in this text, Psalm 114, is in verse 8. And in verse 8, it's going to talk about a story that comes out of Numbers chapter 20. And in Numbers chapter 20, as the Israelites are walking and wandering and complaining, they're saying, God, we are thirsty. God, we are about to die. God, we don't know what to do. And so what God does is he breaks open a rock, and as he breaks open the rock, there's water that comes out. See, I'm not asking you to remember all the details of the story. In many ways, the details of the story are insignificant to understanding the bigger picture of what this is about. But we've got to understand that what God is doing in this text is over and over and over again. Israel is facing a barrier. Israel is suffering. Israel has no idea what to do, and God uses his power to provide a way to remove the barrier and to fulfill the promise. That is what Psalm 114 is all about. So as we understand that text and as we understand the story, the question then becomes, okay, if this is the story, then what does the story tell us about God? What does the story tell us about God's power? And I think there's two things that this text is going to draw out for us that we need to understand, that it's important for every single one of us, no matter how we walk in today, to understand about the power of God. And the first is this, that what God wants to tell us in Psalm 114 is that he is a God that has a preeminent power. That he is a God that has a preeminent power. Now, that word preeminent is not a word that we oftentimes use in our everyday vocabulary. It's not just a word that we throw around. So let me just define what I mean about preeminent. Preeminent means something that is set apart, something that is distinct, something that is unlike anything else in this world. And so when I say that God is a preeminent God, what I'm saying is that God is unlike anything or anyone in this entire universe. That he is set apart, that he is otherworldly, that he is not like you and me. And that is what God is saying in this text, that I am a preeminent God. How do we see it? Well, look at verse 3. What does he say in verse 3? He says, the sea looked and fled. It's the parting of the Red Sea. In verse 4, it says, the mountains skipped like rams and the hills like lambs. He's describing these powerful, large mountains as nothing more than a lamb or a ram, which is not a very intimidating animal. And then in verse 5, he says, what ails you, O sea, that you flee? So here's what God's doing. In this text, he is basically talking trash to his creation. God is looking at these powerful things in creation, these things that oftentimes you and I are in awe of. The ocean, the mountains, these things that are large, that have a massive scope. And he's saying, you know, all those things that you're in awe of, those things have absolutely nothing on me and my authority. So much so that when I am present in the midst of those things, when I am able to use my power, they run away from me. So for you and me, it isn't the mountain or the ocean that we should be in awe of, it's God himself. He's saying, if you want to be in awe of something, don't be in awe of my creation, be in awe of me, the creator, who has authority over all things and all people. That's what you should be in awe of. That is what my preeminent power means. Let me kind of walk it out this way. So a couple months ago, early this spring, my wife and I, we took our kids down to Florida. And we took our kids to the beach for a week, and I have a 4-year-old daughter. I have a son that's a year and a half old. Our son hated everything about being on the beach. He sat on a towel for 5 days. Every time he touched sand, he was mortified by it. He didn't want anything to do with the water, so he just ate pretzels, and that was his beach experience. Not the best. It's a lot of money to take a kid to sit on a towel and just eat pretzels. But our daughter lost her mind day after day when she was at the beach. I have a daughter who's 4 years old, and she's crazy as is, but she got to the beach and lost her mind. And when she went down to the beach and she saw the sand and she saw the waves and she saw the ocean, she literally just ran down and just started running laps all around the beach, screaming at the top of her lungs, "This is amazing! This is awesome! I'm so happy!" And she would run up to me and she'd say, Dad, this is like the biggest bathtub I have ever seen in my entire life. Look at the size of the waves. Look at how far back that it goes. My daughter was in awe of the ocean. And I think that we have a picture of it, and you can just see that as she looks at the ocean, she sees her size and she sees the scope of it, and she was in awe. And as I was watching my daughter run around day after day, losing her mind, I had two thoughts. One, this is amazing to watch. This is a fun thing to see your kid running around just experiencing delight and awe. And I just thought, wow, what an amazing opportunity, and how fun is this? But here's the second thought that I had. I don't know the last time I was in awe of something like this. Like, I've had the privilege of being able to go to the ocean a number of times. And I've had the privilege of being able to go to the beach a number of times. And I don't know when it happened or why it happened, but somewhere along the way, I lost my sense of awe. I enjoy the ocean. I think the ocean is incredibly beautiful. But I don't react the way that my daughter does. It's probably a good thing. She might have taken it a little too far. But I'm not even like flirting with it. And I had this thought, and I thought, man, am I a person who, when I think about God and I think about his power, I'm like my daughter, where I just experience his delight, I experience his joy. I am just sitting there in awe saying, God, I can't believe who you are. I can't believe what you've done. I can't believe that you would invite me into a relationship with you. Or is my attitude like mine when I go to the beach? Just a feeling of indifference. Like, do you walk in here today with just a feeling of indifference? Like, yeah, I know about God. I like God. I mean, I go to church on Sundays. This is just kind of what I do. Or are you a person who's in awe? See, my fear is that there's some of us today that we have lost our awe of God. Like, we have reduced God, we've put him in a box, we've said this is who God is or what God can do, and we have forgotten his power over all creation and even over our lives. We sing songs about the power of God, and we mumble it, and we shrug our shoulders and just say, okay, what's next, God? See, what God is saying to you and me is this: if you understand my power, if you understand that I cause the ocean to flee, I cause the mountains to skip, then we should be people who are just in awe. Day after day, we should come expectantly hoping and wishing that God would use his power and that we would be in awe of him. But the second thing that God shows us is that when you understand my preeminent power, it should also lead you to a place of comfort. That you should be able to find comfort in me. That knowing that God has authority over all, knowing that God is preeminent, that should give us hope and comfort. Let me explain it. So when I was in college, I had a job for 2 summers, and my job was I was a guide. I worked out in Colorado, and I took out backpacking trips. And basically what we would do on these backpacking trips is I would take high school students out. It was mostly youth groups on trips for 6 days at a time. And this was like primitive camping, primitive hiking. You didn't see anybody. You carried everything that you had. You slept on the ground. You went to the bathroom in the woods. You didn't take a shower for a week. It was glorious. And as I say that, some of you are like, no, this is the worst thing. Why you pay for this? This is crazy. Yes, this is my job. It's Curtis's worst nightmare. I told him that this week as we were talking about it, right? But one of the things that was amazing was week after week, I would see the power of God at display. But there was this one trip that I had. It was the hardest trip that I ever took out because this trip was full of a group of guys that every single one of these kids had been pulled out of their homes at some point because of a form of abuse or neglect. And so these kids came from really difficult backgrounds. DFS had come in, and they were living in a home together, and they were basically doing kind of rehabilitation work and counseling and care for these kids. So these kids had never been outside. These kids really struggled the entire time while they were out there. And like day after day, it was a battle with them. They fought me. They didn't want to do anything. They didn't want to go anywhere. And I would just sit there frustrated with these kids, like, can you guys just please just listen to me? Will you please just do what I said? And at the time, I'll be honest, I was very immature. I didn't understand where these kids came from. I didn't understand the experiences that they had. I didn't understand the pain that was in their life. So my tolerance for what they were doing was at a bare minimum. And one of the things that we would always do on these trips is that we would peak a mountain, which is just a fancy way of saying we would climb to the top of a mountain. And one of the things that I was thinking about the night before I was about to take these kids is this is going to be a disaster. Like, I had a hard time doing the easy part with them. How in the world are these kids ever going to get to the top of the mountain? And so I went to bed that night, worried, panicked, and fear, and I just thought, this is going to be terrible. Well, the next day we wake up, and we start hiking. And everything that I feared and everything that I thought was blown out of the water, because these kids who somehow at one time complained about everything, all of a sudden became the most encouraging group of kids that I've ever witnessed on the mountain. And what began to happen was, as they were starting to climb to the top of the mountain, they would just encourage each other. We can do this. You can make it. You're almost there. There were kids that were literally grabbing each other, holding each other's hands as they went up the mountain. And I'm standing in the back as my other guide partner's leading them up, and I'm just watching this in amazement, because these kids were determined to get to the top of the mountain. It's the only group that I ever took out where they refused to go up to the top by themselves. And when we got near the top, they all lined up, they all grabbed hands, and they walked up the mountain together. And when they got to the top of the mountain, every single one of those kids, again, these are some of the hardest kids in the world, some of the toughest exteriors, they all got to the top and they wept. They just started weeping. And there's a couple reasons why they started weeping. One was these kids had never been on a mountain. They'd never seen a mountain, let alone be on top of one. Like, these kids didn't come from privilege. They didn't have money. They weren't going on vacations. Nobody was taking them anywhere. And so these kids got to the top of the mountain. They saw what they saw. They saw the preeminence of God's creation. They said, it leads me to a place of weeping. But the other reason why they started to weep was this. These were kids who for their entire life had been told by everyone, you don't matter, you're not good enough. They had been abused, they had been neglected, they had been manipulated, and they had very little self-value and felt like they had very little that they had accomplished. And when these kids got to the top of the mountain, they were weeping because they realized they accomplished something that was really difficult. And as I saw them weep, I just began to cry. And the reason why I started to cry was I had this thought in this moment, and the thought was this: God's power is louder than this kid's pain. God's power is louder than their pain. It's not that their pain went away. It's not that their pain was all of a sudden different, but their pain in the presence of God was like a whisper next to his power. That is how the preeminence of God can offer us comfort. Because when we experience God, I don't just mean knowing things about God, but when we actually experience him, his power becomes louder than our pain. It's not that the pain goes away, but its power begins to give us comfort. And the reason why I share that today is because there's some of you who walk in here and your pain is loud. Your pain is loud, and justifiably so. There's some of you that come in here and you're dealing with sickness, or you're dealing with miscarriages, or you're dealing with infertility, or you're dealing with broken relationships, or you're dealing with death and grieving that death. And what God wants to say to you today is, my power is louder than your pain. Do you trust and believe that I can be a God who can comfort you? Because I am the God that makes the seas part. I am the God that makes the mountains skip. And I am the God who can comfort you in the most painful places of your life. And the question that probably many of you ask is, well, how can God be a God of comfort? You don't know, Tim, what I'm dealing with. You don't know how painful it is. How can God actually be a God of comfort to me in his power? Well, I think our text tells us. Here's what verse 7 says. It says, tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob. That when we experience the presence of God, not only are we people who are in awe, but we should be people who tremble. John Piper says it this way: if we really knew God, if we knew his grace and his mercy and his justice, then we would be people who would tremble. If we really believe that God was set apart, if we came into his presence, then we would be people who would live in fear. That we would fear God. Now, some of you might sit there and say, well, how does fearing God lead me to comfort? That doesn't sound very comforting. I don't mean that we become people who are scared of God. I mean that we become people of knowing who God is, knowing what he's capable of doing, and yet knowing what he's promised to us. I was thinking about it this way. This is a very odd way to think about it, so just stay with me for a minute. This week I was watching The Bourne Identity. I don't know if any of you have ever seen any of those Jason Bourne movies. Matt Damon's in it. I love everything about Jason Bourne. There's a part of me that wishes I was Jason Bourne, minus like people chasing me and trying to kill me all the time. I think that would get old. But I love Jason Bourne because that guy can take anybody down at any point. Like, he grabs a newspaper and just messes with people. I don't even know how you knock people out with a newspaper. Jason Bourne can do it, right? And I was thinking, like, man, if I was sitting in a room and Jason Bourne walked in, what would I do? Like, what would I do? Like, puny little me, I would be terrified out of my mind if Jason Bourne walked into a room like he's taking fools down with newspapers, right? If you've ever seen those movies, like every time somebody gets a phone call, it's like, hi, I'm Jason Bourne. They scramble, right? They're like terrified. Oh, shoot, what do we do? This is about to go down. Jason Bourne is here. But I was thinking about it. This is real. I don't know why I was thinking about this while I was watching this movie. If I was sitting in a room and somebody was trying to harm me, and somebody was trying to attack me, and somebody was trying to destroy me, and Jason Bourne walked into the room, I would, yes, be full of fear because I know what he's capable of doing, but I also would be full of comfort because I knew that he would be there to defend me, that he would be there to fight for me, that he would be there to rescue me, and not only that he would be there to do it, but he actually would. Like, are you tracking with me? Like, that is what God is saying about you should tremble before me because, one, of who I am, but also because of what I can do. And if you believe the promise of what I've already given to you, that I'm not a God that's here to destroy you. I'm a God that is here to protect you. I am a God that is here to defend you. And I am a God that is here to rescue you. Why? To fulfill my promise. Is that the God that you believe today? See, some of you, your pain is so loud that you have forgotten what God has already promised to you. That God has already promised not just of what I will do, but of what I am doing right now, that I am near to you. So God promises to be a preeminent God, but God also promises us that he is a personal God. God doesn't just say, I lord and reign over my creation. God also says, I become personally involved with my creation. And that is what this whole text in Psalm 114 is all about, right? This is a story. It's a story about real people. It's a story about real experiences. And it's about God's intervention and God's power being used on their behalf. And what God's saying is, I don't just sit in the sky and say, hey guys, figure it out for yourself, but I become a God that is personally involved with you. And so what God's saying is, not only can you trust my preeminent power, but you can trust my personal power. See, I don't know every story that is in this room, but God does. And it's not, God, will you please come into my pain? What God is saying, I'm already there. My promise is already with you. Now, you may not know this because, again, this is not an oftentimes used psalm, but this psalm was not actually a psalm in the way that we just read it. It's not a psalm that just has a bunch of verses we read and then we just go to the next thing. The psalm was actually called a song. It was a song of courage for the Israelite people. See, what the Israelites used Psalm 114 for, the reason why this was intended to be read in the first place, was this was a song that Israel would sing over themselves in moments of doubt and moments of fear and moments of pain to remind them, God, I don't know what you're doing, but you've promised and you've proven that you were faithful. And so every time that Israel had a doubt, every time Israel had a fear, this is the song that they would sing. And the reason why they would sing it is so they could remember, God, I don't know what you're doing today, but I can look back and I know you've been faithful. Why? Here's the evidence over and over again of your faithfulness to me. And so one of the things that we have an opportunity to be is we have an opportunity as we enter into our pain to be people who sing songs, to remind us of the faithfulness and the power of God in our lives. And in some ways, it could be a literal song. That can happen. There may be songs that come to mind. But what I mean is, do you know and can you remember stories if you come in here today experiencing pain where you say, I don't get today, God, what you're doing, but I remember what you did. And because of that, I trust in your power and I trust in your presence right now. Let me tell you one of mine. So one of the things that I've talked about off and on as I've been a pastor here is I struggle and deal with depression. And it's something that I've always struggled with, really when I started getting into middle school and high school and continue to do today. And one of the misconceptions that people have about depression is people think that depression is always a reaction from something bad that happens in your life. Like, that's true. Sometimes bad things happen and people become depressed. But that's not always been the case for me. Sometimes people are just depressed and there's no rhyme or reason as to why it happens. And I've always struggled with that because I look at my life and I say my life, relatively speaking, is pretty good. I don't have a reason to be depressed, and yet I feel depressed often. And there was this moment when I was a junior in high school where depression was just kind of through the roof. And I just felt a tremendous amount of sadness and anger and loneliness. But one of the things that was true for me was I didn't know why I felt the way that I did, and I was really frustrated about that. And at this point, I'd been struggling with depression for years, and I just got to a place where I was like, God, I'm so sick of this. God, can this please just go away? I don't know why I feel the way that I do. And so I would, in my junior year of high school, I would just go through these spells where I would just not sleep at night. And I would just stay up all night and almost deal with insomnia. And I got to this point where a couple weeks just went by, and I just said, God, I'm done. Like, I'm done. Like, I'm so sick of the pain. I'm so sick of having to deal with this. And I just got to this place of saying, I just want to take my life. Like, I want to be done with this. And I just kept thinking about it over and over and over again. Gosh, Lord, just take me or I'm going to take myself. And I finally got to a place where I realized, okay, I don't really want to take my life. But what's at the heart of this is I want to escape. Like, I just want to go away. And I just want this to go away. So one night, March of my junior year of high school, it was a Thursday night, I'll never forget it. I'm sitting in my room, and I'm just so frustrated at this point by how I feel, and I'm so sad and lonely that I just decide, you know what, I am going to get away. Like, I am going to escape. So with about 10 minutes of planning, I made a decision that I was going to run away from my house. And I decided that running away from my house was a way for me to run away from my problems, and at some point, like, it would just get better. And so I get in my car, and I start driving, and my plan was I was going to drive to Florida. And the reason why I was going to drive to Florida was, one, it was warm. That seemed nice. But two, spring break was a couple weeks away, and I figured if, like, this doesn't go well, surely I'll run into somebody down here from my high school, and they can help me. This is not thought out, okay? And I start driving in my car, and I get about 25 minutes into this drive, and I stop, and I realize this is the dumbest idea I've ever had. The intention was right, but what I'm doing is just incredibly dumb. And the reason why it was dumb was, one, I had no idea how to get down to Florida. That's a problem. This was like pre-cell phone, so I didn't know how to get there. Figured the highway would eventually take me there. Two, I didn't really have that much money, so I might have been able to get down to Florida, but once I got down there, I didn't know what I was going to do. Sleep on the beach? That feels uncomfortable. But when I stopped, I realized I don't want to go home. And I have wonderful parents, and I have a great relationship with them, but I don't want to go home because if I go home, I got to confront my problems. If I go home, I got to tell my parents why I left. And so I was just sitting in my car, and I reach down, and I find a worship CD. And I didn't listen to worship music back then. I went to church, but I was more in like the Eminem, Tupac stage of my life, okay? Believe it or not. And so I never listened to this worship CD, and I pull this worship CD out, and I say, well, this can't hurt. And I put it in, and I start listening to it. As I start listening to these songs that I've sung so many times, it's like for the first time they became real to me. These songs about God and who He is and what He's promised. And like God very graciously in that moment reminded me, Tim, here are all these times I've been faithful to you. Tim, here's all these times that I provided to you. Don't forget. Like, do not forget. And so I drove around for a while. And eventually I went home because I knew I had to talk to my parents about this. So I go home, and my parents sit down with me that night, and I go into the room, and they just ask a simple question, Tim, what's happening? Like, what's going on? And I sat there in silence because I knew if I spoke, I would just start weeping. And eventually I did, and of course, like, I would just cry. It's the hardest I've ever cried in my life. And I just told my parents, I just don't feel like anybody really cares. I don't feel like anybody really loves me. I don't feel like anybody really wants to be my friend. I think people like things about me, but they don't really want to know me. And my parents, to their credit, they didn't say anything that night. They just kind of let me cry this thing out. And they just said, hey, can we pray for you? So they came in and they prayed for me. And then I left the room and I went to bed and I woke up the next day. And the next day I went to school. It was a Friday, and I'm sitting in my 5th hour U.S. history class. And there's a friend of mine who's sitting in front of me. And she doesn't know any of this. And she turns around right before class starts, and she says, Tim, can I tell you something? This is going to be a little bit awkward. She said, I've noticed that you're sad. And I don't know what's going on, and you don't need to tell me what's going on. But I want you to know this. I really care about you. And if you ever need to talk to somebody, I'm here. In that moment, she had no idea what she was telling me. But what she was doing is she was answering a prayer, and she was answering a plea and a cry, and it was God meeting me in my moment of despair. The night before, God, nobody cares about me. The next day, hey, I care. Just know that. And the reason why I share that story is because that is a song that I continue to sing today. It is a song that I have to use as a reminder. As I question God's faithfulness, as I question God's goodness, as I deal with depression and anxiety, I can say, God, I don't know what you're doing. God, I don't know if you're near, but I remember. I remember. You've been faithful to me. You've provided for me. And so I ask for all of you gathered here today, what songs do you sing? What songs can you sing? What stories do you have in your life, whether it's through God's word or through your own personal life, that you can say, God, I don't know what you do today, but I remember your faithfulness and your goodness to me. And some of you sit here today and you say, Tim, the pain is too loud. Tim, you have no idea what this is really like. Here's what I would encourage you to do. Write it down. Like, write down, when you go home today, write down, this is how I feel, this is the questions that I have, these are the doubts that I have, and here's why you should write it down. Because one day, I hope that you can look back and you can say, this is where I was, and God, this is where you brought me. Now I can rejoice in you. And for some of you, you aren't experiencing pain, you aren't experiencing suffering, you're just having a great time and you're experiencing a lot of joy. Let me encourage you this, go home today and write that down. I was encouraged by a dear friend of mine, Jack Deere, and he said, every time you feel the affection of God, write it down. And the reason you should write it down is because every time you forget, you can go back to it and remember God's affection and his delight for you. That we need to be people who remember. Because when we are people who remember, we become people who worship God, even in the midst of our pain and brokenness. You may not know this, but in every one of these stories, if you go back and you read the original text, every time God performed a miracle, God exhibited his power, there's two things that the Israelites did. One, they created a memorial. And the reason why they created a memorial was so that they could remember. But the other thing that they did was they just worshiped God for what he had provided and for who he was. And that's God's call on us, that we would worship God in the midst of our pain and remind ourselves, God, you are who you say that you are, and you have been good, and your power is for me. But here's the thing, and we got to check ourselves, and I'll just close with this. Our stories are valuable, but our stories are not enough. Let me say that again. Our stories are valuable, but our stories are not enough. And here's what I mean. Our stories can offer us comfort. Our stories can offer us a reminder. But in the end, we need more than stories to really deal with the pain that is in our lives. If you know anything about the Israelite people, then you know this, that the story after this, after 114, is eventually the Israelites forget about God. They forget about his power. They forget about his provision. And as they do that, they drift further and further away from him. They live in disobedience to him. And what God says to you and I this morning is this. This is a model of a story, but it is ultimately not the story. That there is a better story, and in that story there's a better song, and that story is Jesus. And what Jesus does is Jesus says, I don't just enter into your pain, I have taken on your pain myself. What Jesus says to you and I today is, I am the final Exodus. I am the new Moses. Because what I did was I rescued you out of the slavery of your sin, of the despair and pain of this world, and I now sing a new song of you of hope, which is eternity with me. See, what Jesus does for you and I is Jesus crosses the barrier, he removes the barrier, and he offers us a new life in the way that he did for Israel. But it's even better because it's secured with eternity. It's secured with a future hope. See, some of us, we look at Jesus and we look at the cross and we say, well, how can that be hope for me today? Well, here's what Jesus does. Jesus, by going to the cross, takes a symbol of suffering and he turns it into a symbol of hope. And what that means for you and I today is we look at our world and we look at our lives and we say, God, I don't know what you're doing. And what God says to us is this. There's some questions that you can answer, and there's a lot of questions that you won't be able to answer. But the question that I can answer for you is this. that it's not that I don't love you. It's not that I don't care. It's not that I'm not present. Because what God says to you and I is, I love you and care about you so much, I became personally involved in your pain by taking it on fully. And when we understand the grace and the mercy of Jesus, when we understand the fact that he stood in our place and went to the cross, what it allows us to do is to sing a new song. And the song becomes, God, look at your love for me, that you gave up your power. Why? So that I could have life in you. And when that becomes the song that we sing, then we become like Paul. And all of a sudden, what we do is we approach every single day of our lives and we declare what he declared in 2 Corinthians 12. That we become people who sing, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. That we would become people who would boast all the more gladly in our weakness, because we know that it's in our weaknesses that we see the strength and the power of Jesus in full display. When Jesus went to the cross, he said that the cross is the meeting of my preeminent and personal power on your behalf. And I have not abandoned you. I have not forsaken you. I loved you so much that I stood in your place. And if you trust in me, you will find life and hope and joy. And for some of you, that hope and joy is today. And for some of you, it is in the days to come when we are able to rejoice and worship God in heaven. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for the fact that you loved us so much that you personally became involved. Lord, that you have not abandoned us, but Lord, that you stand over sin. You stand over our pain. And you say, I am Lord of all. I am the King of kings. And yet at the same time, Lord, you loved us so much that you entered into it. So God, I pray for my brothers and sisters today that your voice is not loud. I pray for my brothers and sisters today that are struggling to even believe that you are real or that you are near. Lord, may we cling to your cross. Lord, may we cling to the stories of our lives where we've experienced your power, that we've experienced your faithfulness. And Lord, I pray that we would experience you. Lord, that this would not just be a theoretical idea, just a concept that we hear in church, but Lord, we need to experience you right now. And Lord, I don't know who it is and I don't know what's going on, but I sense somebody in this room needs to experience your power, to know that you are a God that can save, that you are a God that can forgive, and that you are a God that can heal. So Lord, we ask that. Humbly we ask that. By your mercy, will you do that today? We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.